Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval justice and the men who made death their daily business. Forget the romanticized image of noble executioners carrying out swift, merciful justice for grateful crowds. Tonight, we're diving deep into the brutal, corrupt, and psychologically devastating reality of medieval executioners. Men who weren't heroic servants of justice, but social outcasts who lived in the shadows of society, profiting from human suffering while slowly losing their own humanity in the process. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the town square of a medieval English city on a cold morning in 1347, and the smell hits you first, a mixture of unwashed bodies, rotting vegetables, and something else that makes your stomach turn. It's the metallic scent of old blood that is soaked into the wooden scaffold so deeply that no amount of scrubbing can remove it. The platform where men and women meet their end isn't just stained with blood, it's practically built from it. The crowd gathering around you isn't the cheering mob of Hollywood movies. These people are here because Execution Day is the only free entertainment most of them will see all year. But their faces show a mixture of morbid curiosity, religious fear, and something approaching hunger. Many haven't eaten a proper meal in days, and the prospect of watching someone die provides a distraction from their own suffering that they desperately need. But you're not here to watch the execution. You're here to understand the man who performs it. The executioner approaching the scaffold isn't a noble servant of justice or a skilled craftsman proud of his work. He's a broken man whose profession has marked him as permanently unclean in the eyes of society, whose touch is considered contaminating, and whose very presence reminds everyone of mortality in ways that make them deeply uncomfortable. Master Thomas the Headsman, as he's known in official documents, stands 6 feet tall and carries himself with the careful posture of someone who knows that every gesture is being watched and judged. His face is hidden behind a leather hood that serves multiple purposes. It protects his identity from revenge seekers, creates psychological distance between him and his victims, and most importantly, it allows the crowd to see him as something other than human, making the terrible things he does somehow more acceptable. The hood itself tells a story of professional necessity and social isolation. Made from thick leather that's been treated with oils to make it water-resistant. It has openings cut for his eyes and mouth, but otherwise completely conceals his features. The leather has been darkened with soot and blood until it's almost black, and it carries smells that would make you gag. The accumulated odors of fear, death, and the various bodily fluids that execution inevitably produces. But here's what the history books don't tell you about medieval executioners. They weren't skilled professionals who took pride in their work. They were desperate men who took the job because no one else would. And they learned their deadly trade through trial and error that resulted in countless botched executions, prolonged suffering for victims, and psychological trauma that destroyed their ability to function as normal human beings. The tools of Master Thomas's trade reveal the crude reality of medieval execution methods. His axe isn't the sharp, well-balanced weapon of popular imagination. It's a heavy, clumsy tool that's been sharpened so many times that the blade is uneven and unpredictable. The handle is wrapped in leather strips to improve his grip, but the wrapping is stained with blood and sweat from hundreds of previous executions. Most telling of all, the blade bears numerous nicks and chips from times when it struck bone instead of finding the narrow gap between vertebrae that would ensure a clean death. The rope he carries for hangings is even worse. Medieval rope wasn't designed for the precise calculations of drop and weight that would ensure quick death by breaking the neck. Instead, it was rough hemp that caused strangulation deaths that could take 15 minutes or more. during which the victim would struggle and convulse, while the crowd watched in fascination and horror. You watch Master Thomas check his equipment with the mechanical movements of someone who's performed these preparations hundreds of times, and you notice that his hands shake slightly. This isn't nervousness about the coming execution. It's a permanent tremor caused by years of consuming alcohol to numb himself to his work. Most executioners were functional alcoholics who relied on drink to get through their daily duties, and the physical effects of chronic alcohol abuse were visible in their shaking hands, bloodshot eyes, and premature aging. The social position of executioners reveals one of the most hypocritical aspects of medieval society. These men were essential to the functioning of the justice system, yet they were treated as pariahs who couldn't live within town limits, couldn't enter churches, and couldn't touch food in markets without contaminating it. They were required to wear special clothing that identified them as executioners, ensuring that decent people could avoid contact with them. The economics of execution work were as brutal as the job itself. Executioners weren't paid regular salaries. They were compensated per execution, with rates that varied depending on the method used and the social status of the victim. A simple hanging might earn them the equivalent of a few days' wages for a craftsman, while a complex torture execution could provide income for several weeks. This created perverse incentives for executioners to recommend more elaborate punishments and to drag out executions to demonstrate their value to employers. The training process for becoming an executioner reveals the amateur nature of medieval death work. There were no schools or formal apprenticeships. Men learned by watching other executioners and practicing on animals. Criminals who were already dying, or unfortunate individuals whose executions became learning experiences for inexperienced headsmen. The results were predictably horrible, with botched executions being far more common than quick, merciful deaths. The psychological toll of execution work was devastating and cumulative. These men watched people die horrible deaths on a regular basis, often inflicting prolonged suffering through their inexperience or inadequate equipment. They had to maintain professional composure while performing acts that violated every natural human instinct about protecting life and avoiding unnecessary cruelty. Most executioners showed signs of what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares, flashbacks, social withdrawal, and self-destructive behavior. The family lives of executioners were marked by isolation and dysfunction that stemmed directly from their professional activities. Their children were shunned by other children. Their wives were treated as contaminated by association, and their homes were located outside town boundaries where decent people didn't have to see or think about them. Many executioner families developed internal dynamics that reflected the violence and death that dominated their daily lives. The religious implications of execution work created additional psychological burdens for men who lived in deeply Christian societies. The church taught that taking human life was sinful, yet it also supported the death penalty for various crimes. Executioners found themselves in the impossible position of being essential to Christian justice while being excluded from Christian community because of the contamination associated with their work. Tonight, we're going to explore every brutal detail of what it really meant to make death your profession in medieval society. We'll examine the crude tools and barbaric methods that made most executions exercises in prolonged torture rather than swift justice. We'll discover how men became executioners, how they learned their deadly trade, and what the work did to their minds and souls over time. You'll learn about the specific techniques used for different types of execution, the way social status determined how much suffering a condemned person would endure, and the complex relationships between executioners and the communities they served. We'll explore the economic realities that kept these men trapped in their profession, the social mechanisms that ensured their isolation, and the psychological adaptations that allowed them to function while performing acts that would break most people. This isn't the sanitized version of medieval justice you learned in school. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about men who lived at the intersection of law and death, who profited from human suffering while being slowly destroyed by their proximity to violence and mortality. The executioners weren't heroes of justice. They were damaged men whose profession required them to abandon their humanity while remaining human enough to suffer for what they did. Blood money and social outcasts. You're following Master Thomas through the narrow, winding streets of the medieval town as he makes his way home after an execution. And what you're witnessing isn't the triumphant return of a respected professional, but the careful navigation of a social pariah who must constantly manage his contaminated status while trying to maintain some semblance of normal human life. Every interaction he has with other people is colored by their knowledge of what he does for a living. And the fear and disgust in their eyes is so obvious that even you, as an observer, can feel the weight of their judgment. The executioner's house sits on the outskirts of town, beyond the official boundaries where decent citizens are required to live. It's not because he can't afford better housing. His fees from executions actually provide a decent income when work is available. The isolation is legally mandated, part of the complex system of social controls that medieval society used to manage. The contradiction of needing executioners while simultaneously rejecting them as unclean and morally contaminated. The building itself reflects the strange economics of the execution trade. It's larger than what most craftsmen could afford, with stone construction that speaks to Master Thomas's financial success, but it's also deliberately plain and unremarkable. Executioners who displayed their wealth too obviously risked accusations of profiting excessively from death, which could lead to violence from communities that already viewed them with suspicion and hostility. Inside the house, the furniture and decorations reveal the psychological toll of living as a professional killer. There are no religious symbols or family portraits, items that might remind Master Thomas of the normal human relationships and spiritual connections that his profession has made impossible. Instead, the rooms are filled with practical items and the tools of his trade, creating an environment that feels more like a workshop than a home. The most disturbing aspect of the executioner's domestic life is how thoroughly his profession has invaded every aspect of his existence. The leather apron hanging by the door isn't for woodworking or smithing. It's designed to protect his clothes from blood, spray during beheadings. The whetstones and oilcloths on his work table aren't for maintaining farming tools. They're for keeping execution weapons sharp and functional. Even his personal belongings reflect the grim reality of his work. The economic structure of execution work creates a complex relationship between executioners and the communities they serve. Medieval justice systems didn't employ executioners as regular staff. They were independent contractors who were called upon when their services were needed. This meant that executioners had to maintain their skills and equipment without regular income, creating financial pressures that often forced them to accept other types of work that were equally stigmatized. The supplementary income sources available to executioners reveal the interconnected nature of medieval society's most unpleasant necessities. Many executioners also worked as torturers, using their knowledge of human anatomy and pain tolerance to extract confessions from suspected criminals. Others served as animal slaughterers, applying their familiarity with death and blood to provide meat for communities that needed their services, but didn't want to acknowledge their existence. The pricing structure for execution services reflects the complex social hierarchies of medieval society and the varying degrees of suffering that different methods involved. A simple hanging for a common criminal might earn an executioner the equivalent of 3 days' wages for a skilled craftsman. A beheading for a nobleman could provide income equivalent to 2 weeks of normal work. But the most lucrative assignments were elaborate torture executions that could last for hours or even days, generating fees that represented months of ordinary income. The payment methods used for execution services reveal additional layers of social complexity and moral discomfort. Communities preferred to pay executioners in goods rather than money when possible, partly to avoid the appearance of direct financial transaction for taking human life, and partly because touching money that had been handled by an executioner was considered contaminating. Payment in grain, meat, or cloth allowed communities to maintain psychological distance from the commercial aspects of execution, while still compensating the men who performed necessary but distasteful services. The seasonal variations in execution work created financial instability that affected every aspect of executioners' lives. Winter months often brought increased execution activity as courts cleared their dockets before spring planting season, but summer months could go by without any work at all. This unpredictability meant that executioners had to carefully manage their finances while maintaining expensive equipment and skills that would deteriorate without regular practice. The geographic mobility required of executioners reveals another dimension of their social isolation and professional challenges. A single executioner might serve multiple towns and villages across a region spanning 50 miles or more, traveling from place to place as needed and never developing strong roots in any particular community. This constant movement made it impossible to form lasting relationships or establish the social connections that provided security and meaning for most medieval people. The apprenticeship system for executioners was informal and largely accidental, reflecting the fact that most people would do anything to avoid entering the profession. Young men typically became executioners through family connections, sons of executioners who had no other options for making a living, or through criminal backgrounds that made them suitable for work that required familiarity with violence and social rejection. The tools and equipment required for execution work represented significant financial investments that created barriers to entry for the profession while also trapping men who had already committed resources to the trade. A professional quality execution axe could cost the equivalent of 6 months' wages for a common laborer, while the various ropes, knives, and torture devices required for different types of executions could represent an investment equal to the price of a small house. The maintenance requirements for execution equipment created ongoing expenses that ate into executioners' profits while constantly reminding them of their profession's grim nature. Execution axes had to be sharpened regularly and rebalanced when blade damage made them unpredictable. Ropes had to be replaced frequently because they stretched and weakened with use. Most disturbing of all, torture devices required constant cleaning and oiling to prevent rust and ensure that they would function properly when needed. The relationship between executioners and local authorities was complex and often antagonistic, despite their mutual dependence. Town officials needed executioners to carry out legal sentences, but they also needed to maintain distance from men whose work reminded everyone of the violent realities underlying supposedly civilized society. This created a dynamic where executioners were simultaneously essential and expendable, valued for their skills, but blamed for the unpleasant necessities their skills addressed. The legal protections available to executioners were minimal and often ignored by communities that viewed them as convenient scapegoats for broader social problems. While executioners were theoretically protected by law from violence and harassment, these protections were rarely enforced when angry crowds decided to take out their frustrations on the men who carried out unpopular sentences. Many executioners were beaten, robbed, or even killed by mobs who blamed them for deaths that had been ordered by courts and supported by community leaders. The social interactions available to executioners were limited to other social outcasts and individuals whose own circumstances made them willing to associate with contaminated persons. This created insular communities of executioners, prostitutes, gravediggers, and other stigmatized workers who formed mutual support networks based on their shared exclusion from respectable society. The psychological adaptations required for financial success in the execution trade often conflicted with the emotional and moral responses that made men capable of normal human relationships. Executioners who were most successful financially were those who could perform their work efficiently and without apparent emotional distress. But these same qualities made them seem inhuman to potential friends, wives, and even family members. The inheritance patterns within executioner families reveal how the profession trapped entire bloodlines in cycles of social exclusion and moral compromise. Sons of executioners inherited not just their father's equipment and contacts, but also their social status as contaminated persons who were unsuitable for normal work and relationships. This hereditary nature of the profession meant that entire family lines became permanently associated with death and violence across multiple generations. The art of killing, you're standing in Master Thomas's private workshop, watching him prepare for tomorrow's execution, and what you're witnessing isn't the precise preparation of a skilled craftsman, but the desperate improvisation of a man who's learned his deadly trade through trial and error that has resulted in countless botched killings and prolonged suffering for his victims. The tools scattered across his workbench tell stories of amateur technique applied to the most final of human acts, where mistakes can't be corrected and incompetence translates directly into agony for the condemned. The execution axe that Master Thomas is sharpening represents the crude reality of medieval death technology. This isn't the precise instrument of swift justice that popular culture imagines. It's a modified carpenter's tool that's been adapted for human necks through generations of bloody experimentation. The blade is pitted and uneven from countless sharpenings. The handle is wrapped in leather that's stained brown with old blood, and the overall balance is wrong in ways that make accurate strikes difficult and unpredictable. The sharpening process itself reveals the amateur nature of executioner training and the lack of standardized techniques for maintaining execution equipment. Master Thomas uses the same whetstones that any blacksmith might use for farm tools, applying oils and grinding techniques that were developed for cutting wood and metal rather than human flesh and bone. The angle he creates on the blade edge is based on guesswork and experience rather than scientific understanding of how to efficiently sever human spinal columns. You watch as he tests the blade's sharpness by shaving hair from his forearm, a method that provides some indication of edge quality, but tells him nothing about how the axe will perform when striking the dense bone and tough cartilage of a human neck. The testing methods available to medieval executioners were limited and often misleading, contributing to the high rate of botched executions that characterized the period. The rope-making process for hangings reveals even more disturbing aspects of medieval execution technology. Master Thomas twists hemp fibers by hand, creating rope that's strong enough to support a human body, but rough enough to cause maximum suffering during the strangulation process the medieval hanging inevitably involved. The knot techniques he uses aren't designed to break necks cleanly. They're simple slip knots that tighten gradually as the victim struggles, ensuring death by slow asphyxiation rather than quick cervical fracture. The preparation of torture devices requires maintenance skills that go far beyond simple tool care and venture into areas that would challenge modern engineers. The rack needs precise calibration to ensure that it applies enough force to cause excruciating pain without immediately killing the victim. The thumb screws must be adjusted so that they crush bone slowly and predictably. The Iron Maiden requires cleaning and oiling to ensure that its spikes penetrate flesh at the optimal rate for prolonged suffering. The anatomical knowledge required for effective execution work was largely theoretical and often completely wrong, leading to techniques that maximize suffering while failing to achieve quick death. Medieval executioners understood that the neck contained vital structures, but they had no clear knowledge of spinal anatomy, blood vessel locations, or the precise positioning required for efficient decapitation. This ignorance resulted in execution methods that often required multiple strikes, prolonged struggling, and agonizing deaths that could last for minutes or even hours. The psychological preparation that executioners underwent before difficult executions reveals the elaborate mental compartmentalization required to perform acts that violated every natural human instinct. Master Thomas follows rituals that help him distance himself psychologically from his victims, viewing them not as fellow humans, but as objects requiring processing. These mental techniques were essential for functional performance, but came at enormous psychological cost that accumulated over years of practice. The timing calculations for different execution methods were based on rough estimates and folk wisdom rather than scientific understanding, leading to unpredictable results that often horrified even experienced observers. Hanging times were determined by guesswork about body weight and rope strength. Beheading techniques relied on executioner strength and axe sharpness rather than precise anatomical targeting. Torture sessions were timed based on crowd patience and victim endurance, rather than medical knowledge about human pain tolerance. The crowd management aspects of execution work required skills that went far beyond simple killing techniques and involved complex understanding of mob psychology and public theater. Executioners had to pace their work to maintain crowd interest without allowing enough time for sympathy to develop for victims. They had to project confidence and competence even when their equipment was inadequate or their techniques were likely to fail. Most challenging of all, they had to maintain professional composure while performing acts that were designed to be as disturbing and final as possible. The cleanup procedures following executions reveal the extent to which executioner work involved managing the biological realities of violent death in ways that preserved community health while disposing of human remains according to legal and religious requirements. Blood had to be cleaned from scaffolds and tools using methods that prevented contamination of water supplies. Body parts had to be disposed of in ways that satisfied both practical sanitation needs and spiritual beliefs about proper treatment of human remains. The equipment storage and maintenance between executions created ongoing challenges that affected both the effectiveness of future executions and the psychological well-being of executioners who had to live surrounded by tools of death. Execution axes had to be stored in ways that prevented rust while remaining readily available for emergency use. Ropes had to be kept dry and properly coiled to maintain their strength. Torture devices required regular cleaning and lubrication to ensure they would function when needed. The seasonal variations in execution techniques reflected both practical considerations about weather and crowd comfort and deeper cultural beliefs about appropriate timing for different types of death. Winter executions were often moved indoors or delayed until spring because cold weather made outdoor crowds smaller and less responsive. Summer executions were sometimes postponed during harvest season when agricultural work took priority over judicial proceedings. The regional variations in execution methods created professional challenges for executioners, who traveled between different jurisdictions and had to adapt their techniques to local legal requirements and cultural expectations. What constituted proper execution in one town might be considered inadequate or excessive in another, forcing executioners to maintain multiple skill sets and adjust their methods based on local customs and legal codes. The documentation requirements for execution work involved record-keeping that served both legal and practical purposes while creating additional psychological burdens for men who were required to maintain detailed accounts of their killing activities. Executioners had to record the names of victims, the methods used, the time required for completion, and any unusual circumstances that affected the proceedings. These records served as evidence that sentences had been properly carried out, but also created permanent documentation of activities that most people preferred to forget. The quality control standards for execution work were minimal and largely subjective, based more on crowd satisfaction and official approval than on objective measures of efficiency or humaneness. A successful execution was one that satisfied legal requirements, maintained public order, and avoided excessive criticism from observers. The actual suffering of victims was rarely considered relevant to professional evaluation unless it became so extreme that it disrupted the proceedings or created public relations problems for local authorities. The professional development opportunities available to executioners were limited to informal exchanges of information between practitioners and occasional opportunities to observe other executioners at work. There were no guild schools or formal training programs that could help executioners improve their techniques or learn more humane methods. This lack of professional infrastructure meant that each executioner had to develop his own methods through experimentation that inevitably involved causing unnecessary suffering to victims, who became unwilling test subjects for amateur death techniques. The scaffold shadow. You're climbing the wooden steps to the execution scaffold alongside Master Thomas on the morning of a triple hanging, and each step creates a hollow thudding sound that echoes through the town square like a drumbeat announcing death. The scaffold itself isn't the sturdy, well-built platform of popular imagination. It's a hastily constructed wooden frame that creaks and sways under your weight. Built by local carpenters who view the work as cursed and completed as quickly as possible without regard for quality or safety. The platform beneath your feet is stained so deeply with blood and other bodily fluids that the wood has turned black in places, creating patches of discoloration that map out the locations where hundreds of people have died over the years. The stains aren't just superficial. They've soaked into the wood grain so completely that the scaffold carries a permanent smell of death that no amount of scrubbing can eliminate. Rain and weather have faded some of the more recent stains, but the accumulated evidence of violent death is impossible to hide. The gallows structure reveals the crude engineering that characterizes most execution equipment of the period. The crossbeam from which the nooses hang is simply a large tree trunk that's been roughly hewn and mounted between two upright posts. There's no precise calculation of height or leverage. The dimensions are based on rules of thumb that have been passed down through generations of amateur executioners. The result is equipment that works most of the time, but fails often enough to create spectacular disasters that traumatize victims, crowds, and executioners alike. The three nooses hanging from the crossbeam tell their own story of makeshift death technology and inexpert rope work. Each rope is slightly different. One is made from hemp that's been twisted by hand, another from flax that was originally intended for ship rigging, and the third from a mixture of plant fibers that creates an uneven texture and unpredictable strength characteristics. The knots used to form the nooses are simple slip knots that tighten gradually during strangulation rather than the precisely calculated knots that would ensure quick death by cervical fracture. The crowd gathering in the square below represents a cross-section of medieval society united by their hunger for free entertainment and their complex relationship with death and violence. These aren't bloodthirsty savages enjoying human suffering. They're ordinary people whose lives are filled with disease, violence, and uncertainty, and who find psychological comfort in witnessing deaths that are officially sanctioned and serve the cause of justice. The execution provides them with controlled exposure to mortality that helps them process their own fears about death while reinforcing social order. Through spectacular demonstration of official power, the three condemned prisoners being led up the scaffold. Steps represent different categories of medieval crime and the varying degrees of sympathy and hostility that different offenses generated in contemporary society. The first prisoner is a horse thief whose crime strikes at the foundation of medieval economic life, but who maintains dignity and composure that earns grudging respect from observers. The second is a woman convicted of poisoning her husband, whose gender and crime type make her an object of particular horror and fascination for the crowd. The third is a young man barely out of adolescence who was caught stealing bread, whose obvious terror and desperate appeals for mercy create uncomfortable tension between justice and compassion. The timing of the execution reflects both practical considerations about crowd management and deeper cultural beliefs about appropriate scheduling for different types of death. The hanging is scheduled for mid-morning, after early work is completed, but before the heat of the day, makes standing in the crowded square unbearable. This timing also allows maximum attendance while ensuring that the bodies can be removed and the square cleaned before evening activities begin. The official procedures that govern the execution reveal the complex legal and religious framework within which medieval justice operated. A local magistrate reads the sentences aloud, not just to inform the crowd, but to create official documentation that the executions are legally authorized and properly conducted. A priest offers final religious comfort to the condemned, though his effectiveness is limited by the terror and despair that characterize most prisoners' final moments. Most importantly, Master Thomas himself must follow specific protocols that ensure the executions meet legal requirements while avoiding techniques that might be considered excessive or inappropriate. The crowd's behavior during the preparation phase reveals the complex psychology of public execution and the various ways that different individuals process their proximity to sanctioned violence. Some spectators maintain respectful silence that reflects their understanding of the solemnity of taking human life. Others engage in nervous conversation and dark humor that helps them manage their discomfort with witnessing death. A few show obvious excitement and anticipation that suggests psychological problems or unusual comfort with violence. The condemned prisoner's final moments provide insight into the range of human responses to impending death and the various coping mechanisms that people use when facing their own mortality. The horse thief maintains stoic composure that reflects either genuine bravery or psychological shutdown in the face of overwhelming terror. The woman alternates between desperate appeals for mercy and resigned acceptance of her fate. The young bread thief loses control completely, requiring physical restraint to prevent him from collapsing or attempting to flee. The technical execution of the hangings demonstrates both the crude nature of medieval execution methods and the various ways that inexperience and inadequate equipment can transform quick death into prolonged torture. The first hanging proceeds relatively smoothly. The prisoner drops through the trapdoor and loses consciousness within a few minutes as the rope compresses blood vessels in his neck. But the second rope stretches under the woman's weight, allowing her feet to touch the ground and forcing Master Thomas to pull on her legs to complete the strangulation. The third execution becomes a complete disaster when the young man's rope breaks, dropping him onto the ground below the scaffold and requiring a second attempt with a different rope. The crowd's reactions to the botched executions reveal the thin line between justice and barbarism in medieval society and the various ways that communities process the violence that their legal systems required. Most spectators show obvious discomfort with the prolonged suffering that results from technical failures, but they also understand that the executions must be completed regardless of how long they take or how much additional pain they cause. Some observers leave before the proceedings are finished, while others become more engaged as the spectacle becomes more dramatic and disturbing. The cleanup process following the executions involves removing bodies, washing blood from the scaffold, and restoring the town square to its normal function as a market and gathering place. This transition from execution site to commercial space happens quickly and efficiently, reflecting medieval society's practical approach to managing the coexistence of death and daily life. The scaffold itself remains in place as a permanent reminder of official power and a warning to potential criminals, but normal activities resume around it within hours of the executions. The documentation and record-keeping requirements following the executions create additional work for Master Thomas and reveal the bureaucratic aspects of medieval justice that often get overlooked in popular accounts. He must provide written confirmation that the sentences were carried out, including details about timing, methods used, and any unusual circumstances that affected the proceedings. These records serve both legal and practical purposes, creating evidence that justice was properly administered, while also providing information that might be useful for planning future executions. The psychological impact of the day's work on Master Thomas himself becomes apparent in the hours following the executions, as the adrenaline and professional focus required for public performance give way to the emotional and moral consequences of taking human life. His hands shake more than usual as he cleans his equipment. His eyes show the flat, distant expression of someone retreating into psychological compartmentalization, and his movements become mechanical and purposeless as he struggles to process what he's done. The broader social impact of the executions ripples through the community in ways that affect everything from casual conversation to religious observance to commercial activity. People who witness the hangings will carry images and memories that influence their behavior and attitudes for months or years to come. Children who were present despite official discouragement will have nightmares and develop complex relationships with authority and violence. Even adults who consider themselves hardened by experience will find themselves affected by the reality of watching human beings die violent deaths. The financial aftermath of the executions involves settling accounts with local authorities, purchasing replacement equipment to replace items that were damaged or worn out during the proceedings, and planning for future work based on the reputation and contacts that today's performance might generate. Master Thomas's income from the 3 hangings will support him for several weeks, but it comes at psychological and social costs that make normal enjoyment of prosperity difficult or impossible. The torturer's trade, your descending stone steps into the dungeon beneath the castle keep, following Master Thomas as he carries the tools of his secondary profession, that of official torturer for the local courts. The air grows colder and damper with each step, thick with smells that make your stomach lurch. Human waste, infected wounds, fear sweat, and the metallic tang of blood that is soaked into stone walls over decades of systematic torture. This isn't a place where justice is administered. This is a factory for extracting confessions through the application of precisely calibrated agony. The torture chamber itself defies every modern notion of civilized legal procedure and reveals the brutal reality of medieval justice systems that relied on pain and terror rather than evidence and due process. The room is lit by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows on walls lined with instruments designed for the sole purpose of inflicting human suffering. Chains hang from iron rings set into the ceiling, their metal worn smooth by the struggles of countless victims. The floor is uneven stone that's been worn into shallow depressions by years of blood drainage and frequent cleaning. The legal framework that governs torture reveals the sophisticated rationalization that medieval society used to justify systematic brutality in the name of truth and justice. Torture isn't random violence. It's carefully regulated procedure that requires official authorization, follows specific protocols, and serves defined legal purposes. Master Thomas carries written orders from the local magistrate authorizing the interrogation of 3 prisoners suspected of highway robbery, with detailed instructions about the methods to be used and the information to be extracted. The torture devices arranged throughout the chamber represent centuries of accumulated innovation in the technology of human suffering, each tool designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities in human anatomy and psychology. The rack stretches in the center of the room, its wooden frame polished smooth by use and equipped with ropes and pulleys that allow precise control over the amount of tension applied to victims' joints. The thumbscrews sit on a wooden table, their metal surfaces cleaned and oiled to ensure smooth operation when crushing finger bones. Most ominously, the Iron Maiden stands against one wall, its human-shaped interior lined with spikes positioned to penetrate flesh without immediately striking vital organs. The 3 prisoners who await torture represent different categories of suspected criminals and the varying degrees of evidence that medieval courts required before authorizing the use of extreme interrogation methods. The first prisoner is a middle-aged merchant whose expensive clothing and soft hands suggest a life of comfort that makes him particularly vulnerable to physical coercion. The second is a young woman whose gender creates additional complications for torture procedures, and whose obvious terror suggests that threats alone might be sufficient to extract the desired confession. The third is a hardened criminal whose scars and calluses indicate familiarity with violence and whose defiant attitude suggests that extracting information from him will require extreme measures. The preparation procedures for torture sessions reveal the systematic and bureaucratic nature of medieval interrogation methods and the careful attention to detail that was required to ensure legally acceptable results. Master Thomas lights additional torches to provide adequate lighting for precise work, arranges his tools in order of anticipated use, and reviews the written questions that he's been instructed to pursue with each prisoner. The preparation isn't just practical, it's also psychological, designed to build anticipation and terror in victims, who must watch the methodical assembly of instruments that will soon be applied to their own bodies. The interrogation of the merchant begins with techniques designed to assess his pain tolerance and psychological vulnerabilities while demonstrating the torturer's skill and the futility of resistance. Master Thomas starts with thumbscrews applied gradually, increasing pressure slowly while asking questions about the merchant's whereabouts during recent robberies and his associations with known criminals. The merchant's responses reveal both his guilt and his desperation to end the pain, but the legal requirements demand more specific admissions that will satisfy court procedures. The psychological manipulation that accompanies physical torture reveals the sophisticated understanding of human nature that medieval interrogators developed through years of practice. Master Thomas uses verbal techniques that exploit the merchant's social status and personal relationships, threatening to torture his family members and destroy his business reputation if he doesn't cooperate. These threats are often more effective than physical pain because they attack the victim's sense of identity and social position rather than just his immediate physical comfort. The escalation to rack torture demonstrates both the mechanical precision of medieval torture devices and the anatomical knowledge that torturers developed through repeated practice on human subjects. The rack applies tension to the victim's joints gradually and controllably, stretching ligaments and separating bone surfaces in ways that cause excruciating pain, without immediately causing death or permanent disability. Master Thomas adjusts the tension based on the victim's responses and the requirements of the legal case, seeking the optimal balance between extracting information and preserving the victim's ability to provide useful testimony. The interrogation of the woman prisoner reveals the gender-specific techniques that medieval torture incorporated and the additional psychological vulnerabilities that female victims presented to experienced interrogators. Her torture begins with threats and demonstrations rather than immediate physical application, as women were generally considered more susceptible to psychological pressure than men. The threats focus on sexual violence and social disgrace that would be particularly devastating for women in medieval society, often proving more effective than physical torture in extracting confessions. The documentation requirements for torture sessions create detailed records that serve both legal and practical purposes while creating permanent evidence of activities that modern society would consider war crimes. Master Thomas must record the specific techniques used, the duration of each torture session, the exact wording of questions and responses, and any physical damage that results from the interrogation. These records become part of court proceedings and legal archives, creating official documentation of systematic brutality carried out under legal authority. The medical knowledge that torturers applied during interrogation sessions reveals the sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and physiology that developed through practical experience with inflicting controlled damage to human bodies. Master Thomas knows exactly how much pressure to apply to joints before they separate permanently, how long victims can remain conscious during various types of torture, and which techniques produce maximum pain, while minimizing the risk of death or disability that would interfere with subsequent legal proceedings. The psychological toll on Master Thomas himself becomes apparent during the extended torture sessions, as the concentration and emotional detachment required for effective interrogation conflicts with normal human responses to causing suffering. His hands remain steady and his voice stays calm, but observers can see the psychological strain in his facial expressions and body language. The professional competence required for torture work demands suppression of empathy and moral reasoning that takes a cumulative toll on practitioners' mental health and social relationships. The legal outcomes of torture sessions reveal the complex relationship between confession evidence and judicial procedure in medieval courts, and the ways that information extracted under extreme duress was integrated into supposedly rational legal processes. Confessions obtained through torture were considered legally valid and sufficient for conviction, but they had to meet specific requirements about content and detail that ensured their usefulness for court proceedings. The challenge for torturers was extracting admissions that were both legally adequate and factually plausible. The cleanup and body disposal procedures following torture sessions involve removing victims who died during interrogation, treating survivors who require medical attention before trial, and sanitizing equipment and facilities for future use. The mortality rate during torture was significant enough to require standard procedures for handling deaths that occurred during legally authorized interrogation, including documentation that protected officials from accusations of excessive violence or procedural violations. The training and skill development required for effective torture work involved learning techniques that couldn't be acquired through normal life experience and that required systematic practice on human subjects. Master Thomas learned his trade through apprenticeship with experienced torturers, gradually developing the anatomical knowledge, psychological insight, and emotional detachment necessary for professional interrogation work. The learning process necessarily involved causing unnecessary suffering to early victims, who served as practice subjects for developing torturers. The economic incentives for torture work created market forces that influenced both the frequency of torture authorization and the techniques that were most commonly employed. Torturers were paid based on the cases they handled and the results they achieved, creating financial pressure to recommend torture in marginal cases and to use methods that were likely to produce quick confessions. The economics of torture meant that efficient extraction of admissions was more important than minimizing victim suffering or ensuring factual accuracy of obtained information. The condemned last night. You're sitting in the darkness of the castle dungeon on the night before a mass execution, listening to the sounds that emerge from cells holding 12 condemned prisoners who will die at dawn. This isn't the peaceful vigil of popular imagination, where brave souls face death with dignity and religious comfort. This is a chorus of human breakdown that includes sobbing, prayers mixed with curses, desperate attempts at escape that scrape skin from hands and arms, and the involuntary bodily functions that accompany extreme terror. The smell in the corridor combines human waste, unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and the sour odor of fierce sweat that seems to emanate from the very stones. Master Thomas makes his rounds through the dungeon, not as an angel of mercy bringing comfort to the dying, but as a professional checking inventory before the next day's work. His lantern casts flickering light through the iron bars of each cell, revealing prisoners in various stages of psychological collapse. Some have retreated into catatonic silence, staring at the walls with eyes that no longer register external reality. Others pace frantically in the confined space, their movements becoming increasingly erratic as the night progresses. A few maintain desperate hope that pardons or rescues will arrive, checking constantly for sounds that might indicate salvation that will never come. The cell conditions reveal the medieval approach to pre-execution detention, which prioritized security and cost-effectiveness over humane treatment of people who were considered already dead under law. The cells are barely large enough for a person to lie down, with stone floors that provide no comfort and walls that weep moisture in the underground environment. There are no beds, blankets, or sanitary facilities. Prisoners sleep on straw that hasn't been changed in weeks and relieve themselves in corners that create accumulating pools of waste. The variety of crimes represented among the condemned reflects the broad scope of offenses that medieval society considered worthy of death and the relatively minor transgressions that could result in execution when committed by people without social protection. 3 of the prisoners are highway robbers whose crimes genuinely threatened social order and economic activity. 2 are women convicted of adultery whose sexual behavior was considered dangerous to family structure and inheritance law. 1 is a teenage boy caught stealing food who had the misfortune to be caught during a period when local authorities wanted to make examples of thieves. The remaining prisoners include a deserting soldier, a suspected witch, a debt defaulter whose creditors had political influence, and 3 men whose primary offense was being in the wrong place when authorities needed scapegoats for unsolved crimes. The religious ministrations available to condemned prisoners reveal the complex relationship between Christian charity and judicial execution, as priests attempt to provide spiritual comfort while supporting a system that will soon take these people's lives. The prison chaplain moves from cell to cell, offering final confession and communion. But his effectiveness is limited by the terror and despair that make normal religious consolation inadequate. Some prisoners embrace religious ritual as their only remaining source of hope and meaning, while others reject spiritual comfort from representatives of the same authority system that has condemned them to death. The last meal traditions associated with execution reflect both practical considerations about prison management and deeper cultural beliefs about appropriate treatment of the condemned. The meals provided aren't expressions of compassion. They're basic nutrition, designed to ensure that prisoners remain conscious and capable of walking to their execution without assistance. The food is simple bread, watery soup, and small portions of meat that provide enough energy for the next day's activities while avoiding expenses that would strain prison budgets. Prisoners who can afford better food through family connections or personal wealth can purchase upgrades, but most condemned people face death on empty stomachs. The family visitation procedures for condemned prisoners create emotional scenes that are both heartbreaking and logistically challenging for prison administrators, who must balance security concerns with social expectations about final farewells. Wives, children, and parents of the condemned gather in the prison courtyard for brief meetings conducted under heavy guard and strict time limits. These visits often degenerate into desperate attempts to plan escapes, futile appeals for intervention, or simply overwhelming grief that disrupts prison routine and affects the morale of guards and other prisoners. The psychological preparation that Master Thomas undergoes during the night before mass executions reveals the elaborate mental compartmentalization required to kill multiple people in rapid succession while maintaining professional composure. He reviews the execution schedule, checks and rechecks his equipment, and follows personal rituals that help him distance himself emotionally from the humanity of his victims. The preparation isn't just practical. It's psychological armor that protects him from the full impact of what he's about to do. The escape attempts that occur during final nights reveal both the desperate creativity of people facing death and the security measures that medieval prisons used to prevent condemned prisoners from avoiding their sentences. 2 prisoners work together to loosen stones in their shared cell wall, making progress that would have allowed escape if they had started weeks earlier. A woman tries to hang herself using strips torn from her clothing, preferring suicide to the public execution that awaits her. The teenage thief attempts to pick the lock on his cell using a nail that he somehow managed to obtain, working frantically through the night despite having no real skill at lockpicking. The guard rotations and security procedures during final nights reflect the practical challenges of managing people who have nothing left to lose and every motivation to attempt desperate measures. Guards work in pairs to prevent bribery or intimidation by prisoners or their families. Cell checks occur hourly to prevent suicide attempts that would cheat the judicial system of its public demonstration of justice. Most importantly, the guards themselves require psychological support and supervision to maintain their effectiveness when dealing with people whose impending deaths create emotional stress for everyone involved. The sleep patterns and dreams of condemned prisoners during their final nights provide insight into the psychological mechanisms that humans use to process impending death, and the various ways that individuals cope with the knowledge that they have only hours left to live. Some prisoners exhaust themselves with worry and remain awake all night, staring at the ceiling while their minds race through memories, regrets, and impossible plans for escape or rescue. Others sleep fitfully, experiencing nightmares that blend memories of their crimes with visions of the executions that await them. A few achieve periods of deep sleep that might represent psychological protection mechanisms or simply physical exhaustion from days of stress and poor nutrition. The underground communication networks that develop among condemned prisoners reveal their need for human connection during their final hours and the various ways that people facing death seek comfort from others in similar circumstances. Prisoners tap on walls using simple codes to share information, offer encouragement, or simply confirm that they're not alone in their terror. These communications often focus on practical concerns about execution procedures, speculation about possible last-minute reprieves, or attempts to coordinate group actions that might disrupt the planned executions. The personal effects and final possessions of condemned prisoners tell stories about their backgrounds, relationships, and the gradual stripping away of identity that characterizes the transition from living person to execution victim. Most prisoners retain only the clothes they wore when arrested, though even these are often taken away and replaced with simple burial garments. Personal items like jewelry, tools, or letters are confiscated for security reasons or claimed by creditors seeking to recover debts. The few remaining possessions, a worn coin, a piece of cloth, a small religious medallion, become treasured links to identity and humanity that will soon be extinguished. The final letter writing and message passing activities during last nights reveal condemned prisoners' desperate attempts to maintain connections with the outside world and ensure that their thoughts and feelings will survive their physical deaths. Letters to family members express love, regret, forgiveness, and practical concerns about dependents who will need support after the execution. Messages to friends often focus on settling debts, sharing important information, or asking for prayers and remembrance. Some prisoners write confessions or explanations of their crimes, seeking understanding or attempting to provide closure for victims' families. The dawn preparations that begin while prisoners still hope for reprieve mark the transition from night terrors to daylight reality and the final abandonment of hope for salvation. Guards begin gathering execution equipment, building fires to heat branding irons, and assembling the ropes and axes that will be needed for the day's work. Breakfast is served to prisoners who can stomach food, though most are too terrified to eat. Final religious services are conducted for those who desire them, though the effectiveness of spiritual comfort is limited by the proximity of violent death. The mob's hunger, you're pushing through the crowd that has gathered in the town square for the execution of a notorious criminal. And what you're experiencing isn't the orderly assembly of citizens witnessing justice. It's a mob driven by bloodlust, economic desperation, and psychological needs that transform ordinary people into something savage and hungry for violence. The crowd surrounds you like a living thing with its own malevolent intelligence, pressing forward with desperate energy that threatens to crush those at the front against the execution scaffold, while those at the back climb on rooftops and push through windows to get better views of the coming death. The composition of the crowd reveals the broad social appeal of public execution and the various motivations that draw different segments of medieval society to witness sanctioned killing. Merchants have closed their shops and left their businesses to attend the execution. Recognizing that missing such events marks them as antisocial and potentially suspect in communities where public participation in justice is considered civic duty. Farmers have traveled from surrounding villages, timing their trips to market to coincide with execution days that provide free entertainment and opportunities for social interaction. Most disturbing, parents have brought children as young as 5 or 6 years old, believing that witnessing public death will teach important lessons about justice, morality, and the consequences of criminal behavior. The economic aspects of execution days reveal how public death had become commercialized in ways that turned human suffering into profit opportunities for enterprising vendors and service providers. Food sellers worked the crowd offering bread, ale, and roasted meat to spectators who planned to spend hours watching the proceedings. Pickpockets moved through the packed masses, taking advantage of distracted attention and crushed conditions to steal from people whose focus is entirely on the coming spectacle. Most cynically, souvenir vendors sell pieces of rope claimed to be from previous hangings, splinters of wood supposedly taken from execution scaffolds, and other morbid memorabilia that capitalizes on public fascination with death. The crowd psychology that develops during public executions transforms individual spectators into participants in collective violence that none of them would consider acceptable in private settings. The anonymity provided by the mass of bodies allows people to express bloodlust and sadistic impulses that they suppress in normal social situations. Respected citizens who would never harm another person in their daily lives shout for prolonged torture and slow death when surrounded by hundreds of similarly excited spectators. The group dynamic creates permission structures that make extreme behavior seem normal and acceptable. The seating arrangements and viewing positions around the execution platform reflect both medieval social hierarchies and the premium that all classes placed on witnessing public death. Local nobility and wealthy merchants occupy elevated platforms and covered areas that provide optimal views while protecting them from weather and crowd pressure. Craftsmen and successful farmers position themselves near the scaffold where they can see details of the execution procedures. The poor and landless pack themselves into whatever space remains, often standing on each other's shoulders or climbing walls and trees to catch glimpses of the action. The timing and pacing of execution events reveal careful planning designed to maximize crowd attendance and maintain public interest throughout proceedings that could last for hours. Executions typically begin in mid-morning after early work is completed, but before the heat of the day becomes unbearable. The actual killing is preceded by lengthy speeches, religious ceremonies, and procedural requirements that build anticipation while ensuring that maximum numbers of people are present for the climactic moments. The crowd's reaction to different types of execution reveals their preferences for specific forms of death and their sophisticated understanding of the relative entertainment value provided by various killing methods. Hangings generate steady interest but limited excitement because the victim disappears relatively quickly behind the scaffold structure. Beheadings create intense focus on the exact moment of axe impact, with crowds cheering successful strikes and jeering when multiple attempts are required. Learning generates the most sustained audience engagement because the process takes hours and provides continuously changing spectacle as the victim's clothing, hair, and flesh are consumed by flames. The verbal responses that crowds direct toward condemned prisoners reveal their complex relationships with the concepts of justice, mercy, and human suffering. Some spectators shout encouragement and religious comfort to prisoners, expressing genuine sympathy while still supporting their execution. Others hurl insults and curses, projecting their own anger and frustration onto convenient scapegoats who are about to die. Most disturbing, some crowd members make specific requests for particular tortures or execution methods, treating the proceedings like entertainment rather than judicial process. The children's participation in execution crowds reveals medieval attitudes toward childhood exposure to violence and death that differ dramatically from modern sensibilities. Parents point out details of execution procedures to their children, explaining the mechanics of death and the reasons why criminals deserve their punishment. Children compete with each other to get closer to the scaffold, showing excitement and curiosity rather than horror or revulsion. Some families make execution attendance into educational experiences, using public death as opportunities to teach lessons about morality, law, and social order. The crowd management challenges faced by local authorities reveal the thin line between organized justice and mob violence, as officials struggle to maintain control over hundreds or thousands of excited spectators while ensuring that legal procedures are followed correctly. Guards position themselves around the scaffold to prevent crowd surges that could interfere with execution procedures or endanger officials. Magistrates must balance crowd expectations for elaborate spectacle with legal requirements for proper judicial process. Most importantly, authorities must prevent crowd violence from spilling over into attacks on unpopular individuals who aren't officially condemned but might become targets for mob justice. The cleanup and dispersal procedures following executions involve managing crowds that are often reluctant to leave and may be emotionally charged by what they've witnessed. Some spectators attempt to collect souvenirs from the execution site, taking pieces of rope, wood splinters, or even blood-soaked earth that they believe has magical or protective properties. Others linger to discuss what they've seen, sharing interpretations and opinions that reinforce community values while processing the psychological impact of witnessing violent death. The social bonding that occurs during shared witness of execution creates community connections that persist long after the spectacle ends and influence ongoing relationships among people who participated in the collective experience. Neighbors who attended executions together develop shared memories and reference points that strengthen social cohesion while reinforcing collective support for the justice system that provided the entertainment. The shared excitement and emotional intensity of execution events creates psychological bonds, similar to those formed during religious ceremonies or military campaigns. The impact on local commerce and economic activity during execution days reveals how public death had become integrated into the broader economic life of medieval communities. Market days are often scheduled to coincide with executions, maximizing the number of people present for both commercial and judicial activities. Taverns and inns experience increased business from visitors who travel significant distances to attend major executions. Even businesses that don't directly profit from execution crowds benefit from increased foot traffic and the general economic stimulus that public events provide. The weather considerations that affect execution scheduling and crowd behavior reveal the practical challenges of organizing outdoor public events around judicial requirements that can't be easily postponed. Rain creates muddy conditions that make crowd control difficult while reducing attendance among people who might otherwise participate. Extreme heat or cold affects both crowd comfort and prisoner condition, potentially interfering with execution procedures. Snow and ice create safety hazards that could result in injuries among spectators or officials. The communication networks that spread information about upcoming executions reveal the high level of public interest in execution events and informal systems that medieval communities used to coordinate collective activities. Word travels quickly through market networks, religious gatherings, and family connections, often reaching surrounding communities days or weeks before scheduled executions. The advance notice allows people to plan travel and arrange their schedules to attend, while also building anticipation that increases excitement and attendance. The psychological aftermath experienced by crowd members following execution attendance affects individuals differently depending on their personal backgrounds, psychological makeup, and previous exposure to violence and death. Some spectators show signs of emotional disturbance after witnessing executions, experiencing nightmares, intrusive thoughts, or difficulty concentrating on normal activities. Others seem energized and excited by the experience, seeking opportunities to attend additional executions or discussing details repeatedly with anyone willing to listen. Most people fall somewhere between these extremes, processing the experience gradually while integrating it into their understanding of justice, mortality, and social order. The headsman's family are sitting at the rough wooden table in Master Thomas's kitchen during a family dinner that reveals the impossible contradictions of trying to maintain normal domestic life while earning a living through systematic killing. The conversation around the table carefully avoids any mention of executions, torture, or the source of the family's income, creating an atmosphere of deliberate denial that permeates every aspect of their daily existence. The silence about Master Thomas's work is so complete and artificial that it dominates the meal more effectively than any discussion could, reminding everyone present of the unspoken horrors that pay for their food, clothing, and shelter. Master Thomas's wife Margaret sits across from him, her face bearing the worn expression of a woman who has spent 15 years trying to reconcile her love for her husband with her knowledge of what he does to earn their livelihood. She was the daughter of a blacksmith who married Master Thomas before he became an executioner, believing that his work as a castle guard would provide steady income and respectable social position. The transformation of her husband from soldier to killer has been gradual and devastating, destroying her social connections while trapping her in a marriage that provides financial security at the cost of community acceptance and personal peace. The couple's 2 children represent the next generation's inheritance of shame and social isolation that comes with executioner bloodlines. Their son William, now 14, shows signs of the psychological damage that comes from growing up in an executioner's household. His playmates avoid him when they learn his father's profession. Teachers treat him with suspicion and distance, and potential apprenticeship opportunities disappear when master craftsmen discover his family background. The boy has begun showing violent tendencies that worry his parents, but that they're helpless to address without acknowledging the source of their family's contamination. Their daughter Sarah, 12 years old, faces even grimmer prospects as an executioner's child, trying to navigate medieval society's expectations for young women. No respectable family will consider her as a marriage prospect for their sons, effectively condemning her to spinsterhood or marriage to other social outcasts, whose circumstances make them desperate enough to accept an executioner's daughter. Her awareness of her social status is growing as she approaches marriageable age, creating psychological pressure that manifests in withdrawal, depression, and resentment toward her father's choices. The family's living arrangements reflect their efforts to maintain privacy and avoid constant reminders of Master Thomas's profession, while accommodating the practical requirements of his work. The house is divided into public areas where the family attempts normal domestic life and private spaces where execution equipment is stored and maintained. Master Thomas keeps his tools and professional materials in a locked shed behind the house, but the smell of oil, metal, and old blood seeps through the walls and permeates the entire property. Family members have developed the ability to ignore these odors consciously while being constantly reminded of their source subconsciously. The economic benefits of execution work create comfortable material circumstances for the family while simultaneously isolating them from the community relationships that would make prosperity meaningful and enjoyable. Master Thomas earns more from a single complex execution than most craftsmen make in a month, allowing the family to afford better food, clothing, and housing than their neighbors. But their wealth comes with social costs that make normal enjoyment impossible. They can't participate in community festivals, their children can't play with other children, and Margaret can't maintain friendships with other women. The religious complications of executioner family life create spiritual isolation. That compounds their social exclusion and creates additional psychological burdens for people trying to maintain faith. While living with the reality of systematic killing, the family is technically permitted to attend church services, but their presence makes other congregants uncomfortable and clergy treat them with obvious reluctance. Master Thomas's work requires him to take human life regularly, creating theological problems about sin, redemption, and spiritual salvation that the local priest is either unwilling or unable to address satisfactorily. The educational challenges faced by executioner children reveal how family background affects access to learning opportunities and social development in medieval society. William's attendance at the local church school becomes increasingly problematic as other parents complain about their children's exposure to an executioner's son. Teachers find excuses to exclude him from group activities and seem reluctant to invest effort in educating someone whose family background makes normal career advancement unlikely. Sarah faces similar problems with the informal education that prepares girls for domestic life and marriage, as other women avoid including her in activities that might associate them with an executioner's family. The domestic violence that characterizes many executioner households reflects the psychological damage that systematic killing inflicts on practitioners and the ways that professional brutality spills over into family relationships. Master Thomas has never directly physically abused his wife or children, but his work has changed his personality in ways that create fear and tension within the household. His temper has become unpredictable. His drinking has increased steadily over the years, and his capacity for normal emotional connection has been eroded by his professional requirement to suppress empathy and compassion. The social isolation strategies that the family has developed reveal their recognition that normal community participation is impossible, and their attempts to create alternative sources of meaning and connection. They maintain relationships with other executioner families throughout the region, creating a network of social outcasts who understand each other's circumstances and provide mutual support. These relationships are conducted through letters and occasional visits that require careful planning to avoid drawing attention from neighbors who might react badly to evidence of executioner cooperation. The inheritance planning that Master Thomas must consider reveals the generational transmission of social contamination and the limited options available to executioner families for improving their circumstances. William will likely inherit his father's profession because no other career paths are available to him, perpetuating the family's social isolation for another generation. Sarah's prospects are even grimmer. Without marriage possibilities among respectable families, she faces a future of dependence on her family or relationships with other social outcasts that would further cement her marginal status. The household management challenges created by Master Thomas's profession affect everything from shopping for food to maintaining the family home and reveal the practical complications of living as social pariahs in tight-knit medieval communities. Margaret must shop for groceries at specific times and locations, where her presence won't contaminate food for other customers. Craftsmen who might normally provide household services refuse to work for executioner families, forcing them to travel to other towns for major purchases or repairs. Even simple activities like attending market days become complex negotiations of social boundaries and contamination concerns. The psychological coping mechanisms that family members have developed reveal the mental compartmentalization required to maintain sanity, while living with the reality of systematic killing as a family business. Margaret has learned to dissociate completely from any knowledge or curiosity about her husband's work, creating mental barriers that allow her to avoid confronting the details of how their comfortable lifestyle is financed. The children have developed similar defense mechanisms, though their effectiveness decreases as they mature and become more aware of social attitudes toward their family. The future planning discussions that occur within the family reveal their recognition that their circumstances are unlikely to improve, and their need to prepare for lives of permanent social exclusion. Master Thomas has begun teaching William basic execution techniques, not because he wants his son to follow in his footsteps, but because no other career options are realistically available. The training occurs reluctantly and with obvious pain on both sides. but the practical necessities of survival in a society that offers no other opportunities for executioner families make it unavoidable. The medical care challenges faced by executioner families reveal how professional contamination affects access to basic services and creates health risks that go beyond the immediate dangers of execution work. Local physicians are reluctant to treat executioner families, partly from contamination concerns and partly from social pressure from other patients who might avoid medical care from doctors who treat social outcasts. This medical isolation creates particular problems for childbirth, childhood illnesses, and emergency medical situations that require immediate professional attention. The communication patterns within the family reveal how the unspeakable nature of Master Thomas's work affects normal family interactions and creates artificial barriers between people who should be emotionally intimate. Conversations carefully avoid any reference to executions, torture, or the various forms of violence that provide the family's income. This selective silence creates emotional distance and prevents normal processing of stress, trauma, and moral conflict that might otherwise be addressed through family support and discussion. The long-term psychological prognosis for executioner families reveals the generational transmission of trauma and social dysfunction that results from systematic involvement in sanctioned violence. Children who grow up in executioner households show higher rates of mental illness, antisocial behavior, and inability to form normal relationships. The social isolation, economic dependence on violence, and constant exposure to moral contradiction create psychological damage that persists across generations and affects family members who never directly participate in execution work. The bloody scaffold's legacy. You're walking through the executioner's district 50 years after Master Thomas's death. And what you're seeing isn't the gradual return to normal community life that might be expected. It's the permanent psychological scarring that decades of systematic public killing have left on this corner of the medieval world. The buildings stand empty and deteriorating because no one wants to live in places where so much death has occurred. The very ground seems contaminated by the blood that has soaked into it over generations of executions, creating an atmosphere of decay and abandonment that affects everyone who enters the area. The scaffold itself has been dismantled, but the platform's foundation stones remain embedded in the earth, like tombstones marking the deaths of hundreds of people who met their end in this place. Local children dare each other to approach the site after dark, sharing ghost stories about headless figures that supposedly walk the area, and the sounds of chopping axes that echo through the night air. These legends aren't just childhood fantasies. They're the community's way of processing trauma that affects entire populations who witnessed systematic killing and whose psychological health has been permanently damaged by prolonged exposure to sanctioned violence. The executioner families who once lived in this district have scattered to other regions or died out entirely, but their legacy of social contamination persists in ways that affect property values, business activity, and community development decades after their departure. Houses that once belonged to executioner families can't be sold at any price because potential buyers fear spiritual contamination from living in places where killers once slept. The social isolation that surrounded these families during their lifetimes has become geographical isolation that affects entire neighborhoods and creates dead zones within the larger community. The economic impact of the execution district's abandonment reveals how systematic killing affects community prosperity in ways that persist long after the violence ends. Businesses that once served executioner families have closed because no other customers will enter establishments that were contaminated by association with professional killers. Market activity has moved to other parts of town, leaving empty stalls and abandoned commercial buildings that serve as reminders of the social costs of public execution. Even successful businesses in other parts of town report decreased revenue because potential customers avoid traveling through the former execution district to reach their establishments. The psychological legacy of public execution on community mental health becomes apparent in the behavior patterns and social dysfunction that characterize the generation that grew up attending public killings as routine entertainment. Adults who witnessed dozens of executions during their childhood show higher rates of alcoholism, domestic violence, and antisocial behavior than communities that never practiced public execution. The normalization of violence that resulted from regular exposure to sanctioned killing has created cultural patterns that persist long after the execution stopped and affect people who never directly participated in the killing. The religious complications created by decades of public execution continue to affect spiritual life in the community and reveal the theological problems that arise when religious institutions support systematic killing. The local church struggles with declining attendance among people who can't reconcile Christian teachings about mercy and forgiveness with their memories of priests blessing executioners and sanctifying public death. Younger people who didn't witness executions personally still inherit spiritual confusion from parents and grandparents whose faith was damaged by institutional support for systematic violence. The generational transmission of execution trauma affects family structures and child-rearing practices in ways that perpetuate cycles of violence and social dysfunction decades after public killing ended. Parents who attended executions during their youth show decreased emotional availability and increased tolerance for violence in their own child-rearing practices. Children raised by traumatized parents develop behavioral problems and mental health issues that affect their ability to form normal relationships and participate productively in community life. The legal system changes that resulted from public recognition of execution trauma reveal growing awareness of the social costs of systematic killing and the gradual development of more humane approaches to criminal justice. Local magistrates report increased difficulty in finding people willing to serve as executioners, as awareness of the psychological and social costs of the profession spreads throughout the region. The fees required to attract executioner services have increased dramatically as fewer people are willing to accept the social contamination and psychological damage that comes with professional killing. The historical documentation of execution practices that survives from Master Thomas's era provides evidence for modern understanding of how systematic violence affects both individuals and communities over time. Court records detail the increasing difficulty in maintaining public order during executions as crowd behavior became more violent and unpredictable. Medical records show increased rates of mental illness and social dysfunction among people who regularly attended public killings. Most importantly, economic records reveal the hidden costs of execution systems that appeared efficient, but created lasting damage to community productivity and social cohesion. The alternative justice approaches that developed in response to execution trauma reveal communities' recognition that public killing created more problems than it solved, and their efforts to develop legal systems that maintained order without requiring systematic violence. Restorative justice practices that emphasize compensation for victims rather than punishment of criminals became more common as communities sought ways to address crime without inflicting additional trauma on community members. Exile and imprisonment gained popularity as alternatives to execution that removed dangerous individuals without requiring public killing. The scholarly analysis of execution records reveals patterns of systematic BIAS and procedural irregularities that became apparent only when viewed from historical distance and raises questions about the relationship between justice and vengeance in legal systems that relied on public killing. Statistical analysis shows that execution rates vary dramatically based on political circumstances, economic conditions, and social tensions that had little to do with actual crime rates or public safety concerns. The evidence suggests that executions often served political and psychological functions that were separate from their supposed role in criminal justice. The archaeological evidence of execution sites provides physical confirmation of historical accounts and reveals details about execution practices that weren't recorded in official documents. Excavations of scaffold sites reveal evidence of botched executions, torture methods that exceeded official authorization, and disposal practices that violated religious and legal requirements. Skeletal remains show patterns of injury that confirm the crude and often incompetent nature of medieval execution techniques and provide evidence for the prolonged suffering that characterized many public killings. The comparative analysis of communities that practiced public execution versus those that used alternative justice methods reveals the long-term social costs of systematic killing and provides evidence for the effectiveness of alternative approaches to criminal justice. Communities that abandoned public execution earlier show better long-term outcomes in terms of economic development, social cohesion, and mental health indicators. The evidence suggests that public execution created cycles of violence and trauma that persisted for generations and affected community development in ways that outweighed any deterrent effects on criminal behavior. The cultural memory of execution practices persists in folklore, literature, and oral traditions that reveal ongoing community trauma and the various ways that societies process collective experiences of sanctioned violence. Local ballads and stories continue to reference execution events decades after they occurred, suggesting that these experiences remain psychologically significant for community identity and cultural development. The persistence of execution imagery in local culture indicates that the trauma of systematic killing affects communities in ways that extend far beyond the immediate participants and witnesses. The lessons learned from the Master Thomas era about the social costs of systematic killing provide important insights for modern understanding of justice, violence, and community mental health. The evidence suggests that legal systems based on public violence create more problems than they solve, and that the apparent efficiency of execution as a crime deterrent is outweighed by its negative effects on community psychology and social development. The historical record provides compelling evidence for justice approaches that emphasize rehabilitation, restoration, and community healing rather than public punishment and systematic killing. The ongoing monitoring of former execution sites reveals that communities continue to struggle with the legacy of systematic killing decades after the practice ended, and that recovery from execution trauma requires conscious effort and community-wide recognition of the damage that was done. Mental health interventions, economic development programs, and cultural healing initiatives have shown some success in addressing execution legacy issues. But complete recovery appears to require generational change and active effort to develop alternative cultural narratives about justice, violence, and community values. The end of the axe. You're standing in what was once Master Thomas's workshop 30 years after the last execution in the region, and the silence is more profound than any sound you've ever heard. The tools of death that once filled this space have been removed, sold, or destroyed, but their absence creates a presence that's almost tangible. The wooden workbench where he sharpened axes and prepared nooses bears stains that no amount of scrubbing could eliminate, creating dark patches that serve as permanent reminders of the deadly craft that was practiced here for so many years. The transformation of this space from execution workshop to abandoned storage room tells the story of how medieval society gradually recognized the unsustainable nature of systematic public killing and began developing alternative approaches to criminal justice. The change didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process driven by practical problems, social costs, and growing awareness that execution systems created more violence than they prevented. The workshop's abandonment represents not just the end of one man's career, but the conclusion of an entire approach to law enforcement that had dominated European justice for centuries. The regional statistics on execution frequency reveal the dramatic decline in public killing that characterized the later medieval period and the various factors that contributed to this historical transformation. Records show that execution rates peaked during Master Thomas's active years and then declined steadily as communities struggled with the social and economic costs of maintaining execution systems. The decline wasn't uniform. Some areas continued practicing public execution long after others had abandoned it, but the overall trend was toward alternative justice methods that avoided the trauma and community disruption associated with systematic killing. The economic analysis of execution system costs reveals hidden expenses that medieval communities gradually recognized and that contributed to the abandonment of public killing as a standard justice tool. The direct costs of maintaining executioners, building and maintaining scaffolds, and managing execution events were significant, but the indirect costs were even higher. Communities that practiced public execution experienced decreased economic productivity, reduced immigration, and difficulty attracting skilled craftsmen and merchants who preferred to live in areas where systematic violence wasn't part of regular community life. The social research conducted by medieval scholars and religious thinkers reveals growing intellectual opposition to public execution based on theological, philosophical, and practical concerns about the effects of systematic killing on community morality and individual spiritual development. University scholars began questioning whether execution systems were consistent with Christian teachings about mercy, forgiveness, and redemption. Religious reformers argued that public killing brutalized both participants and witnesses in ways that undermined the spiritual and moral foundations of civilized society. The alternative justice experiments that communities developed during the transition away from public execution reveal creative approaches to criminal justice that sought to maintain social order without requiring systematic violence. Restorative justice programs that emphasize compensation for victims became increasingly common, particularly for property crimes that had previously carried death sentences. Exile systems allowed communities to remove dangerous individuals without killing them, reducing the psychological trauma associated with execution while still protecting public safety. The professional evolution of former executioners reveals the difficulty of transitioning from systematic killing to normal economic activity, and the various ways that communities tried to reintegrate social outcasts who possessed no other marketable skills. Some executioners became professional soldiers, applying their familiarity with violence to military service that was considered more socially acceptable. Others worked as slaughterers in meat trades that required similar technical skills but didn't carry the same social contamination. A few attempted to return to the trades they had practiced before becoming executioners, though their reintegration was rarely completely successful. The psychological rehabilitation programs developed for executioner families reveal medieval understanding of trauma and social dysfunction that was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Religious institutions created special counseling services for people whose involvement in execution systems had damaged their spiritual and emotional health. Community support groups helped executioner families develop new identities and social connections that weren't based on their previous association with systematic killing. These early intervention programs showed mixed success, but represented important recognition that execution trauma required active treatment rather than simple abandonment. The legal system reforms that accompanied the abandonment of public execution revealed a complex institutional changes required to maintain social order without relying on systematic killing as a primary justice tool. Court procedures were modified to emphasize investigation and evidence rather than confession extraction through torture. Sentencing guidelines were developed that provided alternatives to death for many categories of crime. Most importantly, new approaches to law enforcement were developed that emphasize crime prevention and community policing rather than punishment and deterrence through public violence. The international comparisons of execution abandonment revealed that the movement away from public killing was a Europe-wide phenomenon that reflected broader cultural and intellectual changes affecting medieval society. Communities that maintained execution systems longer than their neighbors experienced economic and social disadvantages that encouraged them to adopt alternative justice methods. The communication networks that connected medieval communities allowed successful justice innovations to spread rapidly, accelerating the transition away from systematic killing. The cultural memory preservation efforts that communities undertook reveal their recognition that the execution era represented an important part of their history that needed to be remembered and understood rather than simply forgotten. Historical documentation projects collected testimonies from execution witnesses, preserved records of specific cases, and analyzed the social and economic effects of systematic killing. These preservation efforts served both educational purposes and psychological healing functions for communities that were still processing the trauma of their execution experiences. The long-term outcome studies of communities that abandoned execution early versus those that maintained it longer provide compelling evidence for the benefits of alternative justice approaches and the lasting damage caused by systematic public killing. Communities that transitioned away from execution earlier showed better outcomes in terms of economic development, social cohesion, crime rates, and mental health indicators. The evidence suggests that execution systems created cycles of violence and trauma that persisted for generations, and that alternative approaches were not only more humane but also more effective at maintaining social order. The philosophical and theological reflection on the execution era that emerged in later medieval thought reveals sophisticated understanding of the relationship between violence, justice, and human dignity that influenced the development of modern justice systems. Scholars and religious thinkers examined the moral and practical problems created by systematic killing and developed alternative theories of justice that emphasize restoration, rehabilitation, and community healing, rather than punishment and deterrence through violence. The architectural legacy of the execution era provides physical evidence of this dark period in human history and serves as permanent reminders of the social costs of systematic violence. Former scaffold sites have been converted to memorial gardens that honor the memory of execution victims, while acknowledging the community trauma that resulted from systematic killing. Executioner houses have been preserved as historical sites that educate visitors about the human costs of violence-based justice systems. The final assessment of Master Thomas's era reveals a period of human history that was characterized by systematic brutality, social dysfunction, and community trauma that resulted from legal systems based on public violence and professional killing. The evidence shows that execution systems failed to achieve their stated goals of crime deterrence and social order while creating lasting damage to communities, families, and individuals that persisted for generations after the killing stopped. The lesson from the executioner's legacy is clear. Justice systems based on systematic violence and public killing create more problems than they solve and inflict damage on communities that far outweighs any benefits they might provide. The medieval experience with professional execution provides compelling historical evidence for alternative approaches to criminal justice that emphasize rehabilitation, restoration, and community healing rather than punishment and deterrence through systematic violence. The silence that now fills Master Thomas's former workshop speaks not just to the end of one man's career, but to the conclusion of an entire approach to human justice that modern society has recognized as fundamentally flawed and destructive. The end of the axe represents progress toward more humane and effective approaches to law enforcement that recognize the dignity of all human beings and the importance of community healing in the pursuit of true justice.